everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Spook Notes podcast, where we get academic about everything that goes bump in the night. I'm Marlena.
And I'm Connor.
And on today's episode, we will be talking about George A. Romero's The Dead series.
Bum bum ba! I did it this time.
Oh.
So, we're actually going to be not talking about one film today. We're not even going to be talking about two films today. We're going to be talking about three films.
Holy smokes, guys. Can you even handle this shit? I can't.
So get comfortable, because this is going to be...
It's going to be
we're going to go in-depth.
a long podcast,
So, the three films that we're going to be talking about today are Night of the Living Dead from 1968, celebrating its 50th year anniversary.
Woo!
Dawn of the Dead from 1978, celebrating its 40th year anniversary, and Day of the Dead from 1985. We're also going to be touching a little bit on Land of the Dead from 2005, I believe.
However, we're not going to go
into detail with that, especially because you haven't even seen it.
Yeah. I only see the classics, you know?
It's not really considered as good, but it does have some good things that I want to touch on.
Yeah.
So we're going to start by giving you guys a little synopsis on each of the three movies. We're not going to go super in depth on each of them because it would be quite long.
Well, yeah, because we're trying to do all three movies and kind of parallel them to each other, so we can't really go into too much depth. But we're still going to cover the main points of all of the movies, any themes, all that jazz.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with the synopses of the three movies. So, Night of the Living Dead begins with the girl, Barbara, and her brother Johnny visiting a cemetery to give flowers to their father.
They're coming to get you, Barbara. If that's the line from the movie. If you guys didn't know.
So, while they are at the cemetery, they are attacked by a zombie, the first ever on-screen modern zombie, and Johnny is killed. Barbara flees to a nearby farmhouse where she meets an African-American man named Ben, and a host of other survivors holed up in the house. So the majority of the movie takes place within the house and involves the the people trying to survive from attacks by the zombies and trying to survive one another as they slowly turn on each other and start fighting within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the movie, there's only one survivor left, Ben, and he is killed the following morning when a group of people mistake him for a zombie.
Yeah, which is sad. By the way, guys, spoilers here. So if you haven't really seen these movies and don't want it spoiled, we recommend that you watch the movie first, because definitely within the synopsis, we're going to kind of cover all the major things that happen within the movie. So brace yourself.
Mm-hmm. So the second movie, Dawn of the Dead, takes place, I would say, a few weeks or a few months after the beginning of a zombie apocalypse, presumably the same zombie apocalypse that started in Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, so it's just a continuation of kind of what...
I mean, it's never really made official, because you can watch... The thing about these films is you can watch any of them without having seen the others, because there's no characters that carry over.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
But the ideas carry over, and the nature of the zombies carry over.
Well, yeah, you can kind of see, the effect a zombie apocalypse would have on society, and, different aspects would crumble.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, continue.
So, Dawn takes place a few weeks after the beginning of the zombie apocalypse, and the movie basically shows the collapse of society, and the movie starts as news stations are being abandoned, SWAT teams raid apartment buildings looking for zombies and killing anybody they find. We follow four main characters, Peter, Roger, Francine, and Steven, aka Flyboy.
Flyboy!
As they escape in a helicopter and find an abandoned shopping mall where they hole up and try to survive the apocalypse. So the movie basically follows their adventures as they clear the mall of zombies, secure the building, secure food and all the essentials, and steadily they fall into a routine after Roger, one of the characters who dies of a zombie bite. They fall into a routine where they basically become complacent and they lose direction. But this is interrupted by a motorcycle gang that invades the mall, and as a result of this invasion, Flyboy is killed, and Peter and Francine are forced to escape in a helicopter, never to be seen again. And last but not least, we have Day. Day takes place a number of months or so, maybe even a year or more, after the end of the world. Most of humanity is dead, and what's left is an underground bunker full of sadistic military personnel, scientists trying in vain to find a cure, and a few specialized civilians. So together they try to survive and find other people, but fail in both regards since none of the characters seem to get along, and eventually zombies get into the base and kill everyone, except for a scientist that we've been following the entire film named Sarah, a helicopter pilot named John, and a radio specialist named McDermott. Together, these three escape the bunker and fly to a tropical island where they presumably live out the rest of their days, as long as that is. Meanwhile, while this is all going on, there's a scientist in the base who's nicknamed Frankenstein, and he's attempting to tame a zombie named Bub. And Bub eventually learns how to use tools and even speak a little bit and not kill people.
Yeah, he's definitely my favorite character in all of the three movies.
So those are the three films. So now we have some others' opinions. Basically, all three of these films are considered classics. Night of the Living Dead has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, Dawn has a 93%, and Day has an 82%. So, while it steadily goes down...
Yeah, it steadily gets worse. But...
all three of these films are considered classics of the horror genre in different ways. Night of the Living Dead started the zombie genre.
Yeah, it did.
Dawn of the Dead started the career of Tom Savini, who's one of the most important people in all of horror.
It's the weenie.
And Day of the Dead is probably the most... probably one of my favorite films just in terms of special effects. And
no, absolutely. Like, the gore in it is just... it's just beautiful.
Yeah. So, yeah, basically all of these films are considered classics, and they all have impacted the genre in their own unique ways.
Mm-hmm. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about the backgrounds of the movies and any interesting facts that are associated with them. So to start off, zombies weren't invented by George A. Romero. Surprising, right? Zombie movies such as The White Zombie from 1932, starring our boy Bela Lugosi, had actually existed beforehand, but instead of revolving around the modern zombie, they actually revolved around the idea of Haitian voodoo, being that zombies are mindless slaves and they are forced to do their master's bidding. Basically, the ultimate slave, since most of the characters were actually depicted as being black. This ties into the theme of racism in the first film, since zombies before Romero had always been tied to black and voodoo culture, as was a fear prevalent in that society, being that it was the worst thing imaginable for a black slave to still have to remain in servitude after death. Basically, denying them any hope of arrest, which sucks. That being said, Romero did invent the idea of zombies as being reanimated corpses, slowly shambling with the sole intent on eating the flesh of the living. He also invented the trope that anyone bitten by a zombie would turn into one, and that the only way to kill them is to destroy the brain. Another interesting fact is that Romero is actually a Pittsburgh native, and that the first three movies, including many of Romero's other famous movies, that of Creepshow, which is also one of my favorite ones, were also filmed in Pennsylvania, so that's pretty cool. These movies, even the ones with a bigger budget, all have an independent feeling to them, since Romero only worked with a cast and crew he considered friends. And thus the studio feeling never really seeps into these movies, and thank God, because, to be honest, that would just suck. That would just totally kill the whole vibe of the movie. Another interesting fact is that the first movie, Night, wasn't actually popular right out of the gate. Instead, it gained fame over time after being a drive-in favorite, and thus becoming famous for its quote-unquote shocking violence that today would be considered tame. Like, a lot tame. Lastly, the relationship between Night and Dawn in home media is interesting, since Night is actually in the public domain, which means anyone can show and sell it legally. Comparatively, the home media rights to Dawn are held by producer Richard P. Rubinstein so tightly that there hasn't been a release of the movie anywhere in the world for about 6 years. And the cheapest version you can find it in Canada is about $100. And it's pretty interesting because when we actually found this movie, we bought it at a Value Village for 99 cents. I don't know. I just find that's really funny. Simply because we just say it's shit expensive to buy it, anywhere on the interwebs. So I just find it's like it's so funny to me that I purchased it for so little, a movie that is basically so rare, and I love it. It's great. It's one of the best horror movies, in my opinion, that I've seen, and I got it for such a steal.
Before we get into the meat and potatoes of it, I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about our opinions on the films and which one's our favorite, because there's 3 of them, and I think we each have a favorite.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, what's interesting about these movies in particular is that even though they're very famous and iconic within the horror community, I never really saw them until late in my horror education, as I like to call it. This is mostly because I'm not really a big zombie fan, so they never really appealed to me that much. But I realized that they're not really too much about the zombies themselves, and more about the characters and the situations that they're put in. And each of the movies has a different set of characters and a different situation that they're in, and that's what makes them so interesting. So that's why I love them as a whole. But for me personally, my favorite is Day. And that's simply because of one man, Tom Savini.
The weenie.
So I just love the special effects in that movie. I think that they are probably his greatest work ever. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of his. I watch movies just because he did the special effects in them. Like, I'm wearing a Burning shirt right now, and that's a movie I saw simply because Tom Savini did the effects in them. So I just think that the effects in Day are spectacular, and I love watching it. Every time I watch it, I always look at those. That's why I think I love Day so much. But also because it's more introspective of a story, I feel, and it also has, I don't want to say the best characters, but just kind of characters that you are really
It's like
memorable.
a different range of characters as
Like,
well.
I love the character of Captain Rhodes, the crazy...
God, that guy was an asshole.
And I love Dr. Frankenstein, and I love...
I like the Jamaican guy.
And John.
Yeah, like
He's
in his,
hilarious.
what is it? RV? He's just got
John and McDermott are funny.
Oh my god.
And obviously Bub as well. So,
Bub.
For those reasons, I think Day is probably my favorite. But what about you?
Well, I think all the movies are good in their own way. However, my favorite would have to be Dawn, simply because of the setting that it's in. Like, I don't know, when I was a kid, like, I always thought, like, oh my god, it would be so cool just to, like, live in the mall. You know, you would have all the resources there, and it's just like, if you were by yourself, like, you could do anything. You could try on all the clothes. You could eat all the foods. What more can you ask for?
It's certainly like wish fulfillment.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just interesting to ponder, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also like that in Dawn, as we were mentioning before, or actually no, because he does the special effects for Day. However, he does the special effects and...
Well, we're talking about Tom Savini.
Yeah, if you haven't realized this by now. So Tom Savini is also in Dawn as a nomad motorcycle rider. Yeah. And he's just so fucking awesome, you know? He goes in there with his big-ass mustache, doesn't give a fuck.
Plus, there's something about Dawn that, like, I think it's probably the most fun of all 3.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely, in my opinion, the most creative,
mm-hmm.
right? So,
now let's get into
pretty much our opinions on it.
Yeah, so now let's get into the main talking points.
The nitty-gritty.
We're not going to talk about each of these movies as in-depth as we would when we're just doing a independent movie review, but we're going to be talking about one major theme or something that we saw in each of them. So, I'm going to start off by talking about Night. Marlena, you can chime in.
Will do.
So for Night, the major theme that I identified was the theme of racial tension throughout the movie. So, obviously Night of the Living Dead, 1968, is iconic because it introduced the world to the modern zombie. But I think also it introduced the idea that zombie stories are vehicles for other things like satire and metaphor and things like that. And what makes Night so unique is that it was made in a time in 1968 when America was still dealing with lots of issues of racial tension and civil rights. This was the time of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X.
Yeah. And
Um,
sorry, just to stop you right there. You know what I find is very interesting? The fact that the movie was, it was made in 1968, but the style it was made in is, a depiction of an earlier film era. Like
exactly.
it's black and white, and it kind of ties in with the racial tension, like black versus white. I just,
Like for me, I mean, obviously we weren't around back then, but for me as somebody in 2018, when I think about images in the famous speech like that Martin Luther King gave, I think of that famous black and white picture of when he's wearing the suit and he's talking to all those people.
Yeah.
And that imagery, so much is reflective in Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah. No,
With,
absolutely.
Like the sole black guy, man, and hordes of people, and just the black and white, it triggers that imagery in my mind.
Yeah.
But what I think is very interesting is that even though we're talking about zombie movies as vehicles for satire and metaphor, this movie, Night of the Living Dead, didn't really start off like that, because George A. Romero has said multiple times that he didn't write the character of Ben as black.
Oh, really?
No.
Okay.
He simply cast Dwayne Jones, the guy who played Ben, because he was the best actor of all their friends. Because this was still when basically it was just a bunch of him and a bunch of his friends got together to make this movie, and Dwayne Jones was the best actor among them. So George Romero was like, "Sure, you can be Ben." So he didn't really write him as a black character, but he did say that, retrospectively, he did go back and change some of the lines to reflect that he was African American.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, like, we can read a lot into the race of Ben's character, and the fact that he's the sole minority in the house surrounded by a bunch of white people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only a bunch of white people, but a bunch of white people who are mostly incompetent or outright distrustful of him and argumentative. And I mean, especially the character of Harry basically just goes against everything he says, no matter what, no matter the logic, just kind of out of, idealism, basically.
Yeah. Which is just it's just flat out rude. The guy's a douche.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting not only is that he's the only black character, but if anything, he's the only character who really is competent and like knows what to do and knows like how to survive. And I think that's
and how to stay calm too, because definitely the chick in the movie,
Barbara.
fucking useless. She just doesn't do anything. She's just like fear struck the entire time. Yeah. And then you have Ben, who's like the savior of them all, because he can actually make competent decisions and not be dead weight, essentially.
And I think that part of the reason why he's the only competent one is because as a black man living in America at that time, he's probably used to having to stay on his toes and be wary of his surroundings and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what's interesting is obviously that none of the other characters really listen to him because he's black, and he's not the natural leader in their eyes. Like Harry, in any other situation, probably would be the natural leader, except for the fact that Harry's an asshole who doesn't know what he's doing. And then obviously, just in terms of the horror community, it's very important, this role, because this was the first starring role where a black actor plays the lead in a major horror movie. So this is the first time it happens, and obviously there's a big history of that now with movies like Candyman,
Get Out,
and Get Out obviously takes
Blade and all that stuff.
And Get Out obviously takes a lot from this movie as well.
Yeah.
So another interesting fact I wanted to point out was that, as we mentioned, that this was made during the time of Martin Luther King Jr., and then they wrote the ending, obviously, and if we know, the ending involves Ben, the sole survivor, survives until the morning, and then he's just exhausted from, battling the zombies, probably wounded, and he can barely stand, and then we see the two cops, the sheriff and his deputy, who look very kind of rednecky and that kind of thing, and then obviously they mistake him for a zombie and shoot and kill him. And then the end is them dragging out his body in still images. And what I found interesting was that The night that they finished filming this movie, apparently, what I've heard, is the same night that Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
So
Wow.
you can imagine what people were thinking of in 1968 when they saw this movie, when they saw Ben getting shot at the end, and the parallels that it draws.
Oh my god, that's actually crazy.
Two, like, powerful black African-American leaders who are shot and killed by angry whites in a terrible situation.
Did that lead to a lot of people, like, coming to see this movie, do you think?
Well, I don't know, because obviously you wouldn't know the ending of the movie.
Well, yeah, but, like, after
Probably.
the fact.
Yeah.
Wow. Jeez.
And the other thing that this movie that ties into the racial element that this movie has is that it's the first zombie movie, yet somehow it's not the zombies who are the true antagonists. The zombies are more of like a force of nature in this movie, and they just kind of they have one drive, one vision. They just do that. The true antagonist in this movie is Harry, who doesn't listen to Ben and doesn't do anything, that.
Yeah, because you can't even really say the system is the villain. Even though that they kill Ben, really it's by accident.
Like the zombies in this movie and all three really are more of like a force of nature. Like they're like a natural disaster. Like you could equate them to a hurricane.
Yeah.
Because
they come in waves and you don't know.
Like they're not capable
how to prepare for this.
They're not capable of being political or being racist. So in that sense, Harry really is the true antagonist and not the zombies. So the final point I just wanted to touch on very quickly, that in terms of racism, or not, well, just in terms of race culture and stuff with these movies, is that I find it interesting that all three of these movies, there's a prominent black character. Obviously, Ben in this one, Ken Foree's character in Dawn of the Dead, and John in Day. And oftentimes we see with these three characters, they're the characters who are always most in tune with the situation and know kind of what's going on around them. And I think that does tie back into the idea that obviously zombies started in voodoo and Haitian culture. Like, one of my favorite lines or parts in all three films is in Dawn of the Dead, when Ken Foree's character is talking about his grandpa.
That's definitely really good.
Who with the famous line, "When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth." Like, I just think that
it kind of ties in that Haitian culture, right?
Yeah.
Because he knows.
And again with John in the third one, I mean he's not Haitian, he's Jamaican, but
well, they're from similar parts
of the world. Yeah, certainly the culture.
Yeah,
the culture would be there. And again, he is like always the one questioning, and he's the one talking about God and the power of the supernatural within the zombie world. So
yeah,
I just think it's interesting how all four, because in Land of the Dead, the main zombie in it is a black guy who leads the rest of the zombies.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, I mean, I just think that's interesting, and so the racism and race element of Night of the Living Dead is, I think, the strongest in terms of metaphorical. And there's lots of other things you can look into. There's the Vietnam War aspect of it. But I just think when I think of Night of the Living Dead, I think of that imagery tied to Martin Luther King and the racism around it.
No, absolutely.
So, yeah.
So now we're going to talk about the second film in the Dead series, which is Dawn of the Dead. So Dawn of the Dead is a 1978 American independent zombie horror film, which is directed by our boy, as we've mentioned before, George A. Romero. It was written by Romero in collaboration with Italian filmmaker Dario Argento.
Argento.
Fuck. I don't know.
Yeah.
Some dude, I don't know.
Some Italian dude. But he's also a very famous horror director in his own right. Like, he's directed Suspiria, and he did the music for this film along with the Italian band Goblin. Because that's that very famous Dawn of the Dead score was by him.
And as we mentioned before, it is produced by Richard P. Rubinstein. So this film in particular shows a larger scale of any apocalyptic effects it has on society, though it contains no characters or setting from Night of the Living Dead. In the film, a phenomenon of unidentified origin has caused the reanimation of the dead who prey on human flesh.
Human flesh.
Basically, the movie is about four survivors that kind of go through this outbreak who barricade themselves inside a suburban shopping mall amid mass hysteria. So, Dawn of the Dead was filmed over approximately 4 months, from late 1977 to early 1978 in
Pennsylvania.
Frickin' hell. Transylvania cities of Pittsburgh and Monroeville. Its primary filming location was at the Monroeville Mall, and what's really interesting is how they filmed this movie, because, like I said before, they filmed it in a mall, so obviously they can't film it when there's all these customers there, and right? So they actually closed down the mall from 11 p.m. up until 7 a.m., and do you remember how long they had to do that for?
Well, I mean, it was all the time that they were filming all the months, and I specifically remember that
they had to cut something for Christmas.
Well,
right?
in the December they actually stopped filming and took a month off because it would have taken too long to take down all the Christmas decorations every night, because it was already like they had this small window of time, and things like makeup, which is obviously there's a lot of in this movie, takes time. So they actually had to stop filming during the time, and they took a break, except for George A. Romero, who during this time actually edited and put together the first half of the film, which was already made.
Which is actually very smart. This guy's really,
and that
good
way,
with his time.
When they came back from the Christmas break, he had a better idea of what he wanted the second half of the movie to be, because the first half at that point was already finished, edited, and everything.
Yeah, so this film was actually budgeted on $1.5 million, which actually is quite a lot.
For 1978.
Yeah, exactly. And it brought in $55 million worldwide, which is pretty good. It did a very good job. In addition to its 4 sequels, the film has also spawned many numerous parodies and pop culture references. As we have mentioned in previous podcasts, we want to include any inspirations for how the film became to be via the director of the film. For this movie in particular, George A. Romero was invited by friend Mark Mason of Oxford Development Company to visit the Monroe Mall, which Mason's company managed. After showing Romero hidden parts of the mall, during which Romero noted the bliss of the customers, Mason jokingly suggested that someone would be able to survive in the mall should an emergency ever occur. With this inspiration, Romero began to write the screenplay for the film. Another fun fact that not a lot of people may know, according to the original screenplay, Peter and Francine were to actually kill themselves. Peter by shooting himself, and Fran by sticking her head into the path of a rotating main helicopter blade.
Which became one of the kills in the movie.
I know.
The zombie who gets killed by the helicopter blades.
See, that's what they tried to include it. Just as
because it was such a cool gag, and I'm sure Tom Savini wanted to do it.
He's just like, yeah, like, I feel cheated, I gotta get the blades in.
Yeah.
So the ending of the credits would run over a shot of the helicopter blades turning until the engine winds down, implying that the two would not have gotten far if they have chosen to escape. During production, it was decided to change the ending of the film. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the prominent themes that are actually in, or that are reflected in the movie. The main one being that of consumerism, and that the movie is a metaphor for consumerism in 3 main ways. First, being that zombies are like mindless shoppers. Second, the survivors take from the system without giving back. And lastly, raiders are just like Black Friday shoppers.
So I think that in each of these 3 ways, it kind of represents 3 different aspects of the system. So the zombies obviously is the biggest one, that they walk around the mall,
kind of saunter around, going from store to store.
Without much direction, kind of aimlessly, right?
Yeah.
And it's like what they say in the movie. Flyboy says, the zombies are here to get us, but then Ken Foray is like, no, they're here because it's what they remember and it's what they're used to. So it's that idea that even in death, we're beholden to the consumerist system because it's all we know. And in the 70s, like, shopping malls were just becoming like a big thing in the States. So they were actually relatively new, and not every city had them. So to see something like this was kind of like a major thing at the time, just like how the first one, how it dealt with racism was a big issue at the time. People were being afraid that like these major malls would kind of destroy all the small town business.
Well, yeah, because with a mall, really, you don't have to plan out too much where you're going because it's all just kind of in one place. Whereas prior to that, I guess you'd have to plan out like your shopping trip or whatever, depending which stores you wanted to go. So that kind of like feeds to the problem.
Yeah, that's why there's the criticism that mall shoppers are mindless, like zombies.
Dun, dun, dun,
And then obviously the second part of that, the four survivors in the movie, are also like shoppers because they take from the mall, and I mean they can't really give back to it, but they become complacent in their situation within the mall, right?
well, yeah, because they're constantly just relying on all the supplies in the mall to kind of keep them alive. Like it's that keeping them alive.
It's not really living. It's not like they're not trying to better themselves. They're just kind of going with the flow and going with the system. Mm-hmm. So in that way, they also are kind of like the zombies because they both kind of fall back on what they're used to.
That's right.
You know?
That's true.
And then obviously the raiders.
They enter the building, honestly, like Black Friday shoppers. They just don't even care. They just kind of plow right down the doors. Well, and they're riding motorcycles as well, so they're going right through the mall on the motorcycles. And it's just like madness, right? Like it's just like Black Friday. Like I don't know if you see those videos on Facebook, but you know when the employees are opening up the doors on Black Friday and you see that herd of people just coming in. I don't know, that's what I thought of when I was.
It's definitely similar imagery. It's just kind of
sure.
like the chaos that they bring in. They just do whatever they want, and that's kind of like the craziest part of the movie because they just kind of disrupt the system that's there, the system that the survivors and the zombies have built, kind of.
Well, yeah, that kind of leads into the second major theme that we're thinking of is order versus chaos. So, as we were mentioning before, with the motorcycle riders, it's just pure chaos what they do, and essentially you kind of need that in this situation that's happened to the survivors because like later on in the movie as they've gotten kind of all settled in and stuff like that, they become depressed because there's nothing to really live for. You know, they're already safe from the zombies. They have their food stock all piled away. They're safe, right? So they need that chaos to kind of get them through the day, which is what the motorcycle raiders bring to the film.
Because if anything, you know, like these four people, well, three at that point, because Roger's dead. Yeah. They're like people of action, and they're like happiest when they're like getting things done, and like that's why they are so depressed near the end of or when they've become complacent and settled down because they have just nothing to do. So if anything, they kind of not like, but they kind of need that stimulus, right? Mm-hmm. And again, it's that idea of you need both the yin and the yang.
That's true. Also, another group of peoples that represent chaos within the system is the country hicks are more effective when killing the zombies than the National Guard in urban locations. And they think of it as a sport and actually have a good time doing it. So it kind of supports what we were saying before. Like, you almost need that chaos to kind of just get through the situation. Like, yeah, sure, it's great to have some order, but when your life has become so heavily regimented, it's just boring, and it's just like, who cares at that point? You might as well just, off yourself.
And I think that the zombies represent the ultimate mix of those two things, because they are chaos in the fact that they just kind of destroy everything, eat everybody. They cause chaos in other people and panic and things like that. But in the sense, they are also incredibly ordered because they live by a very strict set of rules. All they do is eat. They can only be killed by destroying the brain, and it's like boom, 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 ordered. They have a pattern.
Well, yeah, and they also come like an army as well.
They're predictable.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
So they represent, I think, in them both of those, like the perfect balance of both of those things.
Absolutely. And lastly, zombies are more than just the obvious in the movie. So, as we were saying before, the four main characters can be seen as allegories for zombies, as they are slaves to the bureaucratic system.
Exactly. But yeah, like we said before, I think by the end of the film, when the four of them are just in the mall together, they're more like zombies than any of the other people, than the motorcycle raiders or any of the people in the beginning of the film.
Well, yeah, just they're doing the same thing every single day. They're eating, you know, they're sleeping,
And,
all that stuff.
like, they found the zombies in the mall, took all the zombies away, and then they become the zombies in the mall.
Ah. Oh, whoa!
So yeah, so that's basically what we found for Dawn of the Dead, right?
Yes. So now we're going to kind of transition into the third and, I guess not final movie that we're going to touch on, but we're just going to talk about the third movie.
Mm-hmm. So in this movie, I think one thing that I think we haven't mentioned yet, but each of these films represents the decade that they were made in.
That is true.
You know, the 60s, obviously, the main, tension that was there was the racial tension.
Mm-hmm.
In the 70s, it was fear of being consumed by a system that they didn't like, by a capitalist system. Mm-hmm. And in the third one, fits the 80s so well because the 80s were a time of great excess when everything was big. Big hair, big clothes, everything was big. And this film, Day of the Dead, is the biggest of all the films. Literally in the sense that it had the biggest budget, and biggest in the sense that
it had the most gore.
The setting of it, like the place where they are, is the biggest.
Huge.
It's like this gigantic underground cavern. So in all those different aspects, this is the biggest and most excessive of all the films.
That's the 80s for you.
And the other thing that is a characteristic of the 80s that I think is reflected in Day of the Dead is the 80s was a time of extreme greed, mm-hmm. when the 1% was growing more powerful and the 99% was growing less. And it's no surprise that most of the characters in this film are incredibly self-serving assholes. Obviously the military guys and their leader, but also even the scientist of Frankenstein. Like, he's more concerned with his personal creation of Bub than actually trying to come up with any kind of cure or help anybody.
That's true. It's like you can fix one, well, not fix, but kind of, alter one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have millions. Who even knows, right?
Yeah, so it is kind of like...
Well, Bub is the 1%.
Yeah.
Amongst the many.
Amongst the zombies. The other thing about this film that I think is interesting is that... this is really the bleakest of all the films.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's the farthest in the future, and by this point humanity is like at its wit's end. We see the worst parts of humanity in this movie.
Yeah.
With Rhodes and the other military personnel. Like, they're just... There's nothing redeeming about them. They're complete and total animals and violent and just the worst kind of peoples. And it's ironic that these are the people who make it to the end of the end of the earth. Like, these are the people that's left. All the assholes.
I can't really remember. Did they get into contact with any other humans from any other parts of the world? I literally cannot remember.
Well, if you remember, in the beginning of the movie, they go into the city. That's when they have that big city scene, which is like one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And they can't find anybody. And I think there's a line when they get back to base that they've like flown 70 miles up and down the coast both ways and haven't found anybody.
Wow. So essentially, yeah, they're
this is all
the last living people that they know of.
Another thing that I found interesting about this movie is that it's the first one to kind of touch on why this might be happening in terms of a biblical sense. Mm-hmm. Because the character of John states that he believes that God might be trying to punish humanity for looking too far into his creation because we're always questioning and asking why, like the scientists in this movie do. And he said, and in a way, it's kind of similar to the Noah story, because in the Noah story, God was unhappy with the state of the earth, so he's like, well, I'm just going to create a big flood.
Cleanse it of all its sins and all that.
Exactly, wipe everything out, and we're going to start anew. And, maybe that's what's going on with here. Maybe God created these zombies to wipe out humanity, and then he's going to start anew with the zombies.
Well, yeah, because, if you see humanity reflected in this movie, they're just all assholes, aside from Sarah and the Jamaican guy.
And McDermott.
And him and Bob.
But,
and
but
that's
even
it.
even with Sarah though, like John was mentioning, like maybe the problem is that she's not leaving Will enough alone. She keeps trying to ask why instead of asking how would we live? Like just trying to solve the problem or trying to figure it out when really they should just be spending their days what's left of their time in peace, which is ultimately what they end up doing on the tropical island.
Yeah.
So the other thing about this movie is I think it's much more retrospective than any of the other films. I mean, there's a big zombie set piece in the city at the beginning, and then the big one at the end. But I mean, in the middle, it's just like mostly just characters talking about their problems and dealing with their struggles.
Different clashings of like social power and stuff like that, right? That's what we can pretty much see within the middle of the movie, because you have that reflected with the military personnel, and then the scientists, and then Sarah, and then the other guys, and then the zombies. So it's like all these different sources of power just coming together in one big
they're like
war zone.
They're like different factions.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Hunger Games. The Hungry Games.
Yeah. Well, at least the humans are all separated into different factions when they should be working together and not separated. And then lastly, I just want to point out that just like the first film, persecution is still a big part of this movie, because they bring up race in terms of referencing the color of Sarah's boyfriend Miguel's skin. He's Latino, and they call him yellow and say that that's the reason why he's such a coward and everything like that. And Sarah obviously is harassed by the military guys because of the fact that she's the only woman in a big group of men. So both of these characters are persecuted for who they are, which is, again, the theme that connects these movies.
Well, also, I don't know is his real name Frankenstein? It's not.
Well, that's the nickname they give him. I can't remember the real name. I think it's like...
Well, also, like, he's kind of persecuted in a way, too, because, like, he's a man of education, a man of science, and then going up against the military personnel, which are all just brute force, right? It's something that they don't have is I don't want to say they don't have intelligence, but they don't have the capability of abstract thought, which is what Frankenstein has. So in a way that he's kind of ostracized as well, right?
Yeah, so I mean, that's, I think, really all we have to say for Day.
Yeah.
Finally, before we move on to the last bits, I just want to quickly talk about Land of the Dead, which you haven't seen.
No, I haven't.
But I'm just going to quickly mention that I think that Land of the Dead from 2005 follows the pattern of the rest of the series, not only timeline-wise, but in the fact that each film represents the decades that they come in. Land, obviously, was early 2000s, post 9/11, George Bush era America. And the movie deals with themes of terrorism. Like, in the movie, literally someone threatens to blow up a large tower full of lots of people.
Oh my god.
And another character says the famous Bush line, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." But also the idea of America's place in the world, which people were questioning at that time, and I think still questioned today. And if people / America are causing more harm than good. And it almost has kind of a climate change-like message in the film about the effects humans have on the natural world. Yeah. So that's Land of the Dead. Not really considered as good as the other ones.
Quick question. So if it goes by different decades, do you know why they didn't do one in the 90s? Just curious.
I just think George Romero was doing other stuff. I mean, I think that is because Day of the Dead, I don't think it did as well as Dawn, so the studio didn't want to make another one. And then Land of the Dead was just kind of like, oh, George Romero's back.
We're back, bitches! Yeah.
And then he made... Well, then also, there's more than these four, by the way.
No, I know. There's the Diary
other ones are
of the
pretty
Dead.
bad.
Yeah.
Let's not talk about that. So, the next two things we want to talk about is kind of the evolution of different things within the series. One being the evolution of the zombies within the series. Yeah. So I think there's a very specific timeline that they follow, right?
Yes.
So let's start. Like with the first one, Night of the Living Dead, The zombies were the most primitive. The only thing that they really did that was anything like human is a few of them used tools, like the one used a rock, and the little girl, obviously, with the spade.
Yeah. But essentially, they weren't, like, too creative when it came to, like, their killing tactics. They kind of just saunter around,
Shambled
like,
around.
shambled, like. But as you see, like, in the later movies, they're more, like, violent with how they're doing their movements and attacking, essentially
So
evolving like a species.
Yeah, even in their physicality, like you say.
Absolutely.
So, and then in the second one, the idea is introduced when Flyboy dies that the zombies remember their past lives and do things instinctually. Flyboy remembers where he lived with Francine and Peter, and he finds it, even though it's hidden from any other of the zombies' views, I guess you could say. So there's the idea that they remember things from their past lives. Third, obviously the big one here is Bub, is the first zombie who doesn't just eat humans, and he even feels emotions and acts on a higher mental level than any of the other zombies.
Well, yeah, because he can learn how to, use certain tools. I think one of them was being like cassette tape or something like that. Like he can learn how to turn it off and on.
And then obviously the gun.
Yeah, which is like really essentially fine motor skills.
Mm-hmm.
It's instead of like, the more basic bitch zombie who just kind of like whatever arms out in front of them. Like, no, Bub is different. He's the OG, not even the OG, he's the better G zombie where he can do more advanced stuff,
And then finally in Land of the Dead, we see, I think the climax of this is that the zombies in that movie kind of form their own society, and they have a leader, they communicate with each other, and they plan out an attack. Like they plan to attack the city in Land of the Dead. Yeah. And then I think the culmination of this evolution of zombies ends in the idea that maybe humanity should just end and zombies should take over.
Yeah.
Because maybe they are better.
Because essentially, I don't know, the way I'm thinking of this is like it kind of goes full circle in a way, right? Because you start off with humans, one of them gets bit, they bite everyone, they become, all zombies and stuff, and then once all the zombies die out, then humanity starts again, and it just kind of keeps on going, right? Like,
yeah,
in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I'm going with that.
No, I mean, I think it makes sense. It's cyclical in nature.
Yeah.
And then maybe something that you want to touch on this or not is the evolution of kind of the female characters in the movie and how they become more useful, I guess you could say, as the movies go on. Like in the first movie, Barbara is, like we said earlier, is mostly useless. She's in a state of shock, and the entire family doesn't really do anything.
Well, like, you know what? I'm pissed off by Barbara. She is just dumb. She didn't do anything in the first movie. She was just kind of, like, sitting there chilling. Oh, my God, there's zombies. You know what, Barbara? You gotta get your shit together, woman. You gotta fight for what you want.
It's funny, actually.
Sorry, I just got really angry right there.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned how there wasn't one in the 90s.
Yeah.
Well, in the 90s, Tom Savini remade Night of the Living Dead in color and with more gore. And he made Barbara more of like a badass, like shotgun-wielding lady.
Oh, good.
So,
jeez.
There's that. But yeah, anyways, so Barbara's mostly useless in the first one. In the second one, in Dawn, Francine begins the movie similar to Barbara in that she's seen as like kind of freezing in zombie situations and things like that.
Well, yeah, and she's just like, oh, I'm pregnant. Oh, I can't do anything. Oh, poor me.
But by the end of the film, I mean...
I feel like I'm getting really salty with these ladies right now.
But, well, by the end of the film, Francine does learn how to use the helicopter, and it's because of that she ends up saving herself and Peter.
Good. So, in a sense, like, she kind of evolved as well. Like, she became more badass and got her shit together.
And then ultimately, in the final, in Day of the Dead, Sarah, the main character, is seemingly the only character in the bunker who has her head in the right place, all the while she's dealing with the most abuse as her status as a female.
Well, yeah, even if you look at her partner, he's kind of like...
It's the reverse.
He's kind of like Barbara in a way, or Francine, I guess. Like, he's just... like, coward. He's just petty. Like, oh, I'm shot. Oh, help me. Like, I don't know. So it's just, yeah, like, Sarah's definitely the flip of that.
Mm-hmm. And then, last but not least, in terms of connecting all these movies, I think that there's a very specific timeline that these movies follow. Basically, the way I explained it to you and the way I have it set up, the way I imagine it, is Night of the Living Dead, okay, is basically the first 2 days of the zombie apocalypse. We see the very beginnings of it, the first zombies ever. Dawn of the Dead is about the first 2 months as society descends into chaos and things start getting really bad. Mm-hmm. Day of the Dead is like the first 2 years after it, where most of humanity is dead, society's all but gone, and there's only small remnants and bits of humanity left trying to put the pieces back together. And then lastly, Land of the Dead is like 2 decades after the zombie apocalypse happens, and humanity has kind of come back in a very primitive way where the rich are at the top and the poor at the bottom. But also the zombies have now advanced. They're now their own society.
You know what? I really want to see the movie Land now. Now that I've seen the other 3, it'd be a nice comparison.
I think it's still a fine movie. Basically, the way I always describe it to people...
It's not classic, right?
The way I always describe it to people is that the concept of it is better than the execution. The actual movie itself sounds cool when you talk about it, but when you actually say it, you're like... Oh.
What is this?
It's not terrible, but it's just not good.
Mm. I see. Well, maybe then I'll just read it off of Wikipedia and be like, yep, I've seen the movie.
So
lastly, we're just going to talk about some of the fears that the film touches on. First being literally being eaten. Like, come on, this is a zombie film. Like, that would suck to be eaten. Of course you're going to be scared of that. Second being losing all individuality and becoming one of the horde of the zombie, like conforming to...
Like, as we as humans really prize our individuality, so it's... I don't know, I feel like the worst thing would just, be just...
One of the many, Next is the fear of the loss of society. What do we even do when all the rules of the government and human order are stripped away? So that's another legitimate fear. And lastly, the fear of fellow man itself.
Exactly. Like I said, the main antagonist of all these films is, in a way, not even the zombies. The main antagonist is the people. Poignant. So, final thoughts. I mean, for me, all these movies have very involved and nuanced social criticisms at their core, and that more than the horror of the zombies is what makes them such effective pieces of art to this day. And I think that's why they're still classics, because they have that deeper meaning. And that's why I think they're such great movies to talk about on a podcast like this.
Yeah, no, you pretty much said it. I personally just like seeing just how the movies themselves evolved from you have that black and white, and then it transitions all the way until
to the modern day.
Yeah, exactly. So it's for me really interesting to see how the zombie first started out and then just kind of grew and evolved over time. It's just very interesting to see. Yeah. So yeah, overall, I really enjoyed seeing all 3 movies, and maybe I will check out Land as well as the other ones if I'm brave enough,
Yeah. So, well, that's our podcast for today.
Yeah, I hope you guys liked it. I hope you guys are still awake, just because
it was a little bit of a longer one.
Yeah, but we said before, we didn't want to go into too much detail with the movies. However, we wanted to kind of still analyze them on a deeper level than just being like, yeah, there's a zombie in this movie. And
then finally, you don't have to worry. Next week's episode will not be this long. Do you want to say what next week's episode is going to be?
Yeah, we actually had one of our followers recommend this to us, and we're going to do the movie Alien.
Yeah, Ridley Scott's Alien.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that one.
So you can always send us an email at
spooknotes@gmails.com.
If you have any thought, gmail.com.
Well, I'm pretty sure you have gotten my sense of humor by now. But yeah, you can always listen to us on iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. And yeah, as always, don't forget to cite the Spook Notes.
Bye.
Bye.